Hello all! You made it to the last chapter of the semester, which we will cover on personality. And as you will notice, there are some overlap with the therapy chapter because the theories on personality are actually applied in explaining and treating psychological disorders. So in part 1, we will revisit the psychodynamic perspectives and discuss some neo-Freudians. We will also discuss about behavioral and social cognitive perspectives on personality. So first, what do you think is personality? For example, if I'm having a bad day and I look sad or grumpy and perhaps drinking coffee more than I should, does that mean that I have a certain personality, like pessimistic personality? I mean, that may depend. If I'm always acting that way, maybe I do have certain personality. But the key here is that the certain characteristics need to be long-lasting or permanent. So a personality is a pattern of enduring characteristics that influence how an individual adapts to the world. So following this definition, if an individual has a certain type of personality, we would expect this individual to behave in a consistent way with his or her personality. In other words, our thought process and behaviors do not change. It is permanent. So in this lecture, we will go over how various theories would explain personality. So first, can anyone tell me who this individual is? By now, this should be an easy question, as we've probably seen him multiple times, unless if you are experiencing a Freudian slip. So, he is Sigmund Freud. And according to Freud, he viewed that personality is primarily associated with our, what do you think? Unconscious. So it is beyond our awareness. So do you remember this iceberg analogy of personality? So based on the psychoanalytic perspective, there are three basic structures of personality. In the unconscious, there are id and superego. So just to review, id is considered as a pleasure principle, where it tries to get an immediate gratification. On the other hand, superego is our conscious, and it makes a harsh internal judgment of our behavior. And so id and superego will often fight and crash due to their differences. And in our conscious, there is the ego, which is considered to be the reality principle or act as a mediator between the id and superego. And again, a lot of times there is a conflict between id and superego, and so the ego will try to mediate the two. So you could expect that id is present from the first day we were born, always wanting to satisfy immediate gratification. Whereas superego and ego are formed later in our life, usually influenced by our parents or social surroundings. But according to this theory of personality, if for some reason that a child's personality is not developed normally, such as due to maltreatment, then the ego and superego will not be developed normally. As a result, ego may fail to rely on his or her ability to face a particular situation, and also failing to act as a mediator between id and superego. And this may lead an individual to become, for example, submissive, and will lack self-confidence or courage. And the superego would also be weak, as the child may not have a chance to develop the morality of what is wrong versus what is right. So the child might develop negative ideas such as a lifelong hatred of particular people, like their parents or even a system. So it becomes critical to develop healthy ego and superego. So in the therapy chapter, we discussed several examples of defense mechanism, which again was ego's way to reduce conflict between the id and superego. So in repression, we use an analogy of sweeping it under the rug. So basically, repressing our feelings because it may be too overwhelming to face it. Displacement was like kicking the dog. So for example, let's say you had an issue with the supervisor at work, but you couldn't confront the supervisor. So instead, you kicked the dog. And last, sublimation was redirecting the energy to something that is more healthy. For example, going to the gym and working out. And there are many other examples of defense mechanism, and here we will cover three more. So denial is where an individual denies the occurrence of the threatening events, which is replaced by a benign but inaccurate one. So you might be wondering what is the difference between denial and repression, considering that both distort reality by keeping things hidden from our conscience. So the difference between the two is that repression does not necessarily deny the event, but rather repress the feelings, but again, not the event itself. Whereas denial is the denial of the event, thereby leading one to place it with the less threatening one. Another defense mechanism is the reaction formation, where an individual behaves in a way that is completely the opposite of the true feelings. So for example, let's say I'm talking with my friend how much I want iPhone 12 Pro. But I don't have enough money I could spend, especially, when trying to raise kids. And I found out that another friend of mine bought iPhone 12 and asked me if I want to play around with it. And I become frustrated and denies the offer. So this is an example of reaction formation and typically happens due to our unconscious envy or jealousy. Another defense mechanism is projection, where an individual takes his or her own unacceptable qualities or feelings and blaming them on other people. So for example, say that you hate someone, hypothetically, but the superego tells you that such hatred is unacceptable. So the unacceptable qualities or feelings. And so you try to solve the problem by believing and convincing yourself that they are the ones showing signs of dislike to you, even that may be inaccurate. So basically blaming on the others. Another example might be that a bully projects their own feelings of vulnerability, such as sense of insecurity in life, onto the target and blaming the target for the sense of insecurity. So as we talked about it in the therapy chapter, there are many contributions to psychoanalytic and psychodynamic approach. But some of the concepts that Freud developed were not free from criticism, such as interpretation of dreams, and Freud was not willing to listen to them. And so as a result, there were a group of people who were once siding with Freud but left and incorporated their own ideas. And these people are called Neo-Freudians, who are the previous followers of Freud who now developed and added their own theories. And there are a lot of Neo-Freudians, but here I will talk about the three individuals. One of the well-known Neo-Freudians is called Carl Jung. According to Jung, the personal unconscious is the unconscious mind just as described by Freud. But one of the main contributions of Jung was adding what is called collective unconscious, which is the unconscious mind shared by all human beings. So this could include, for example, morals, ethics, concepts of fairness, of right and wrong, and even fears and phobias, such as like fears of darkness, loud sounds, or blood. And these may be all rooted in this collective unconscious. And according to Jung, these are all inherited genetic traits, and therefore called collective unconscious because they are shared by all human beings. Another Neo-Freudian is Alfred Adler, who developed what is called individual psychology. So unlike Freud, who proposed that the pleasure principle or id as a key motivator, Adler thought that individuals' drive for seeking perfection is humans' key motivator. And during this process, we often feel inferior, and Adler believed that the drive of becoming superior is the driving force behind personality. And he came up with this theory because he himself was not tall. Therefore, he was not able to compete physically, but he attempted to overcome the feelings of inferiority by seeking something he was good at, which was his academic performance, where he eventually attended medical school. Adler is also the only or one of the few psychologists who believed that birth order have a direct association with personality characteristics. So how many of you are the firstborn child? According to Adler, firstborn children tend to feel inferior to the younger children who receive attention. And as a result, they tend to become overachievers. How many of you are the younger or youngest child? Adler thought that younger child also feels inferior because they don't have the freedom or the responsibility of the older children. So they're kind of spoiled. And Adler thought that the middle children are in the most advantageous position, considering that the older siblings can provide inspiration, and at the same time, they are also not the youngest child, so they have that responsibility of the older children. And the middle children tend to be very competitive as well. So how well did this theory explain your situation? And note that there are many other environmental factors that may play a role, which may be why not many psychologists really talks about any theory based on birth order, but it is kind of fun to talk about it. The last Neo-Freudian we will talk about is Erik Erikson, who we actually have already talked about in the developmental chapter. So do you remember his stage theory on psychosocial development? That looks like this. Rather than focusing on the sexual relationship like what Freud emphasized, this theory focused on the psychological and social development, covering the entire lifespan. And if you remember, this was a pretty big theory, so I won't go in depth. And although we did not talk about Erikson in terms of the relationship with Freud, he was also one of the many psychologists who were influenced by Freud. Next is about behavioralism. How do you think behavioralists would view personality? Hint is that, can we actually see personality? No, right? We cannot see personality. And because traditional behavioralists focus more on what we could observe and measure, they actually never use the term personality. And rather, they perceive personality as a set of learned responses or habits, which are basically well-learned responses that has become automatic. So people who are extrovert, behavioralists may explain these outgoing behaviors by receiving reinforcement at some point in their lifetime, and they continue to engage in those outgoing behaviors and became automatic and parts of their habits. However, as we will discuss next, social cognitive theorists thought that this behavioralist view was too simple. So does anyone remember who was Albert Bandura? We talked about him in the learning chapter. So he was a psychologist who conducted research on observational learning, such as the Bobo experiment. So the Bobo was used to demonstrate the impact of observing an adult performing aggressive behavior, and as you can see in the picture, the children are imitating the adult's aggressive behavior. So what this experiment suggests is that our behavior could be influenced by other people's behavior. In addition, Bandura also believed that our expectation also matters. So if you believe that you could master a situation, then you're more likely to succeed. For example, if you have a positive belief about the upcoming exam, then you're more likely to study, ask questions, and be less anxious compared to if you have a negative belief about the exam. So to summarize Bandura's ideas, our behaviors, environment, and personal or cognitive belief all interact with each other. So using the same example about the upcoming exam, again, you're more likely to study for the exam, which is the behavior, if you have a positive attitude about the exam, which is the personal characteristics or cognitive belief. But also the environment matters. If you have a group of friends who could help you study or keep you motivated, then you're more likely to study and have positive attitude about the exam and the class. And this is called reciprocal determinism because these factors are influencing each other. And last, we will talk about another social cognitive psychologist named Walter Mischel, who criticized previous personality research. So say that there is an extrovert. Then we would expect this individual to be social and talkative wherever this person is. But how would you think this individual would behave in a quiet place, such as inside the library? Probably would not be very talkative. But how would this mean in terms of personality? Because in the beginning of the slide of today's lecture, we talked that a personality is an enduring and permanent characteristics. But if a person with certain personality behaves differently depending on the situation or the environment that they're in, then there may not be such thing as a personality. So we say this, that there is no cross-situational consistency. Because again, depending on the situation, we would act differently and there is no consistency. But if there was a cross-situational consistency, it would also be pragmatic and maladaptive. So for example, for people who have competitive personality, it would probably not be so good in becoming super competitive when playing a chess against a small child. So we don't want that. But then how should we study personality? So here's what Mitchell did. He examined how much time a child can wait before a child ate a cookie. And the researcher told a child that if a child was able to wait until the researcher came back, then a child would get another cookie. But in fact, that was a lie, and the researcher would not come back. And the real intent here was that the researcher would measure how long a child would be able to wait. And of course, some children immediately ate the cookie after the researcher left, but others waited for a long time. And how is this associated with our personality? So this was in fact a longitudinal study where he followed up among these children after 10-20 years. And what he found was that those children who were able to delay gratification, so being able to wait eating the cookie longer, have better academic performance and better self-regulation skills. And obviously how we self-regulate looks very different when we are a child versus when we are an adult. But being able to wait eating a cookie and being able to endure studying for a long time and not going to the party often are coherent behaviors. So this was what Mitchell was interested in. So again, he was interested in the coherence and the patterns of behavior as opposed to the consistency across different settings. Because again, human behaviors may not be consistent across different situations. So that's all I got for part 1 of Chapter 10, Personality. And if you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, I will see you in part 2 of the video. Thanks and take care.